Now, with growing calls for historic student debt to be scrapped, we take a look at how this impacts the country's economy and the higher education sector. The funding crisis also led to the #FeesMustFall protest movement against increases back in 2015. 8 years later, the debt owed to institutions of higher learning has ballooned. For more on this, we're joined by CEO of University South Africa, Dr. Phethiwe Matutu. Thank you very much, Doc, for your time this morning. Perhaps we could start with an overview of this historical debt. If we take a look at various institutions, just how much are we talking about?
The historic debt in 2020 was audited by the Department of Higher Education and Training to be sitting at 16.5 billion for the institutions, 9 billion of which was not considered to be recoverable. So it poses an issue of a lack of sustainability for the higher education sector. So it is important that one manages it and controls it in such a way that it doesn't balloon out of control. And also we have experienced in some countries, such as Nigeria, a situation where academics were protesting because they had not been paid. So it is a possibility that a higher education sector can be unsustainable. It's not something which is unheard of. It does happen.
And then let's talk about the funding of institutions of higher learning in South Africa. We spoke to Wits University in the week, and they spoke of 3 streams of funding, not only from national, but they've also got other private funders as well. And so is that the case, or is that standard for every university, or are those that rely solely on government?
The level of, they're normally called 3 streams of income. The first one being the block grant coming from the Department of Higher Education and Training, which is based on the number of students that universities admit according to their allowed quotas or their allowed percentages. Normally we call this the enrollment plan. So once universities have agreed together with the Department of Higher Education and Training on the number of students to be admitted, if they over-enroll or they under-enroll by a percentage more than 3%, they do get penalties for that. So the long and short of it is that that block grant is depending on the planning. The second income stream is based within the Department of Higher Education and Training. It's based on outputs. So the students which are graduating, the research outputs of the university, the masters and the PhD students which are graduating. And that is more the research component of the grant. So that is coming from government. The next one is the one which is the second stream income, which is coming from the students' fees. So universities charge student fees which are understood to be subsidized because of the amounts that I've already indicated, block grant together with the research output funds. So the universities now, depending on their size and so on, they are able to get this income from student bursaries, and these vary from institution to institution on the basis of a number of things, the quality of the offerings. Sometimes your engineering qualifications are not likely to be the same as your BA qualification, for instance, due to the infrastructure which is required to produce an engineering student. So that is the second stream income. And then the last one is where the universities then approach funders which are outside government. And that is likely to be your agencies, be it of government or otherwise, the private sector organization, international funders, and that would be your third stream income. So depending on universities, that becomes quite huge for some universities. where the government component becomes as small as even 20% sometimes. But the majority of the universities are reliant on the student fees together with the government funding.
That reliance on student fees, especially in a country like South Africa, how sustainable is it? And the fact that we're still talking about this in 2023 perhaps is telling, because you speak of containing or controlling the student historical debt not to balloon out of control. What does that look like when you find that a majority of some of the learners are coming from indigent households?
That is why NSFAS was introduced previously as TEFSA in order to support students coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds. That has changed from being partly a loan to now being fully funded by government. So the majority of the students are funded through this National Student Financial Aid Scheme. And there are no repayments. So considering that that number is growing annually, then you find out that there are certain areas which have to suffer as a result of funding the NSFAS. For instance, the infrastructure funding, for instance, the postgraduate funding. So one has to look at the sustainability of whatever model that we introduce. And outside the NSFAS funded students, there's also the missing middle that universities have been concerned about.
In fact, at the heart of the students' cry,
which is considered to be the major contributor to the debt that we are experiencing within the higher education sector.
Doc, at the heart of the students' cries, at least this week, they've also mentioned NSFAS being a problem when it comes to issues of accommodation caps, for instance. And so maybe what is it? Is it an issue of universities making accommodation so inaccessible that you're finding these learners, again, from indigent households having to rely on NSFAS, which has put a cap, or at sometimes students are not even able to access that, and they can't afford now to get accommodation, and therefore have to sleep in libraries. You spoke of Nigeria, for instance, where in terms of the unsustainability of this debt, where professors were not getting paid, and they then, went on strike. But where can we look to models that are working on the continent, maybe if we compare apples and apples?
It is quite fortunate that the Minister of Higher Education and Training had a ministerial task team which looked at this element. So they are giving options to Parliament. And the understanding is that before the end of March, Parliament would have looked into these options and decided on which one to take. And the issue is not rocket science. If you keep on funding without replacing, there are high chances of a lack of sustainability, particularly in an economy such as ours, which is growing at a very, very slow pace in the broader scheme of things, with welfare people constituting the kind of numbers that ours constitute. So whatever funding which is coming from government has to come from a very solid tax base. And secondly, if it's not coming from a solid tax base, then it means that it has to be replenished somehow. So what they are providing are the options of that sustainability, how best to sustain it, and also taking into cognizance the fact that the missing middle is not a homogeneous group. There are people within the missing middle who are being funded successfully by parents. There are those within the missing middle who are being funded because they are themselves working, and there are those there who are just getting loans from banks. So those are the parents of the missing middle students. And finally, there are those who cannot afford, and that is the reality. So if one then is able to stratify these groups and be in a position to come up with solutions of how best to deal with the issue, then it becomes something which is sustainable. They are providing such options, and it looks like they are not going to be short-term kind of solutions, because we're looking at a long-term solution. So while then trying to resolve it, there has to be the current status quo of NSFAS. Now, when NSFAS is saying they are capping the residence fees, that does have negative ramifications for some of the universities. For instance, 15 of them were saying that they are going to be appealing and have already appealed that decision. 5 were saying that they were going to appeal the decision because of a variety of issues. And among those are the fact that universities have built infrastructure, in some instances taking loans from the providers, and the refund, or at least the interest which needs to be paid, has to be maintained together with a certain proportion of that debt. Others are leasing accommodation, and they're having university staff manning that accommodation, providing transport costs to students in order to make that accommodation to be sustainable, what they want. They then see that the cap is just not going to be adequate. So we are looking at some institutions saying the difference between what NSFAS is providing and what we are prepared to offer for our NSFAS student is more than 200 million, for instance, for a particular institution. So apart from NSFAS concerns that there's collusion among the service providers, there are real costs which are getting into the student funding, which justify certain amounts of money, particularly in relation to the location of the universities and what it costs for the universities to maintain their land and so on and so on. And one has to bear in mind that a student has to be well nourished academically, the well-being, the health, and these universities provide, in most cases, all of these things to ensure that the academic project does continue.
Dr. Phethiwe Matutu is the CEO of Universities South Africa. Thank you, ma'am.